Welcome, everyone. Our speaker today is Professor Keith Brouthers. He's Emeritus Professor of Business Strategy at King's Business School in King's College London and a Fellow of the Academy of International Business. I know many of us here do not need any introduction to Professor Brouthers. He specializes in international strategic management. He's a very impactful scholar. He received the Gibbs Decade Award in 2012, as well as the Gibbs 50-year Anniversary Research Scholarship Award in 2019. Professor Brouthers' research has been published in several leading journals. There's a long list. I'm not going to take up too much of your time reading them. We extend a very warm welcome to you, Professor Brouthers.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you all. This paper is really about a relatively new issue. And this is why, I mean, for most of my career, we just had traditional internationalization through wholly owned subsidiaries or joint ventures or whatever. And we were dealing with this thing called liability of foreignness, which firms had to figure out how to do business in a different country, and that's all. That's what we taught in international business courses, and this is what firms dealt with. But then this new digital technology, the internet, cell phones, all that came about, and it actually offers a new way to internationalize through digital ventures like websites or mobile apps, social media, digital platform complementers. And because of this, not only are firms faced with this liability of foreignness, but they also face something new called a liability of outsidership. And the question is, since traditionally, firms overcame the liability of foreignness by standardizing or adapting part of their business model. The question is whether doing the same thing, standardizing or adapting this business model, will help overcome not just the liability of foreignness, but also the liability of outsidership for these digital ventures. Traditional internationalization, of course, includes things like wholly owned subsidiaries, joint venture, exporting for most firms. And they face this thing called the liability of foreignness, which is created because different countries have different cultures and different geographic makeups and different competitors. And it's issues like that they have to figure out how to deal with, it, which might be different in the foreign country than it is in the home country. And so the degree of liability of foreignness really depends on how different or how similar that is. And the way they deal with it is by either standardizing if it's similar or adapting their business model, things like the product. They might have to make changes to the product to fit better. And a lot of consumer products are faced with this, where they might have to reduce the size of the packaging, which also impacts pricing, right? So in poorer countries, your product might be reduced in size, and therefore people will be able to afford it, where they couldn't afford something that might be sold in the American size. And then promotion efforts might need to change because the way people communicate and get their ideas might be different. And the way that you distribute within the country might be different. So in the US, we have these big retailers, where in other countries, it's just lots of independent shops. So the way you distribute through those would change. So now, though, with the digital internationalization, again, with these four ways of creating digital internationalization, firms face those same liabilities of foreignness, right? They still have to deal with the cultural differences and the geographic differences and all that, but they also have to deal with this liability of foreignness. So that means that there's some informal institutions that might differ. like attitudes towards online shopping, things like that. There's formal institutional distances, which is differences in laws and regulations about doing business online. Digital infrastructures might vary. In some countries, of course, the digital infrastructure is fairly advanced, but as you move from one country to another, the digital infrastructure varies. It might be stronger, it might be weaker. They might have good internet connections or bad connections, or very few people have connections. Some might only have connections on the phone versus computers. So, and then the entrepreneurial ecosystems might also vary, which again is a way of thinking about, in entrepreneurial countries, changing to digital ways of doing business seems like something that's well accepted. But if you're not in an overly entrepreneurial country, these new ways of doing things might create some barriers for you. So the question we really were interested in is, does standardization and adaptation of the business model help firms overcome all these issues when they're using digital ventures? So I keep talking about this liability of foreignness, so let me briefly explain what it is. Basically, a liability of foreignness occurs when a company is not embedded in the networks and the connections with local firms, government agencies, or customers in the country, which makes it very difficult to gain visibility and attract customers. So traditionally, what firms would do to overcome liability of foreignness is they would enter a market maybe with a joint venture partner who's local, and they have those connections. Or they would export through an agent or distributor that has connections. Or they would open a wholly owned subsidiary, and through doing that, make contact with local firms and government agencies, and customers would see them. So their visibility would be pretty straightforward, and it would be more easy to attract customers because you could go and physically see and deal with them, sort of the boots on the ground idea. Now, the other side, of course, are digital firms, which are just online in an app, on a platform, on a website. And the question is, how do potential users find out about these companies, and are they going to be comfortable dealing with them or not? So firms that have an online presence, so they could be in every country. Right? I know when digital really started in the 90s, and the internet got going, people were really excited because they said, well, if you have a website, you're available everywhere in the world. And technically that is true. But the question is, how does someone outside your area, and it's not necessarily even a country area, but how do potential users find out about you? So the lack of physical presence in a foreign country and these visible touch points for customers or on the ground sales force really creates a problem for online retailers, or it's not just retailers, of course, it's also business to business. So besides these issues, right, besides the issue of how do you get noticed, how do you attract customers, there's these other issues like the lack of social trust in online businesses. A lot of people just don't like doing business online. Now you're going to like this because I'm one of those people. I much prefer to go to a shop to buy things than buying them online. But it could be, there's lots of people in the world that are like this. There's societal differences in attitudes towards technologies. In some countries, being online, having advanced technology is the best thing. And as we all know, as academics, you sit in that classroom and the students are playing with that technology instead of paying attention to what you're saying. So obviously, there's going to be a very different attitude towards technology and businesses on technology with this younger generation than there might be with some of us that are slightly older. And then there's variations in laws and regulations governing online activities. Here in Europe, we have this very strong data protection laws, which makes it difficult for lots of businesses to go online because they have to worry about how do they safeguard that data from hackers. And there's other laws and regulations that come into play, right? There's laws on taxation. For example, Amazon set up their operation, their headquarters in Europe, in Ireland, because they have a lower tax rate. So when I buy something from Amazon in the UK, the transactions are all done through Ireland. Otherwise, they have to pay UK taxes. And so understanding all this really has an impact on these online ventures. And then national disparities in technology infrastructures and entrepreneurial ecosystems. Of course, we all come from countries with fairly advanced technology, so 5G phone networks and all. But a lot of countries aren't that advanced yet and don't have strong internet connections. I mean, if you're following this, the operations in Gaza, they have trouble connecting to the internet at all. In the Ukraine, there's intermittent internet variations. So different countries, of course, have the ability of having more advanced internet connections, which is required for these digital ventures. All right, so on to the next here. So what's the purpose, or what do we propose in our study? So that's sort of the background. So our basic proposals are, number one, digital ventures face a liability of foreignness, so they need to consider how standardization or adaptation might help overcome that. But digital ventures also face this liability of outsidership generated by differences in informal institutions, formal institutions, the type of digital venture, because we also talk about how, if you internationalize through a mobile app or as a complementer, these liability of foreignness could be different. So your need to standardize or adapt might vary. Digital infrastructure, right? If you've developed your technology in a 5G country and you're moving to a country that only has 3G, you're going to have to deal with those differences in technology, right? Or you're going to have a failure for a venture. So that's our basic set of propositions there. And I think we have a copy of our model coming up next, if I remember. There we go. Hard to see, I know. But basically, it's in the paper, so when you download the paper, you'll be able to see it and actually read it. So we basically say, the bottom left-hand corner, there's those factors that influence a liability of foreignness, and those are traditional factors that all international firms need to deal with. Then above that, the box above that, are these liability of foreignness, or liability of outsider issues, which firms internationalizing through digital ventures need to deal with. Then, as we said, this idea that digital venture type might come into play. And all that feeds into sort of the second block from the left, which is the business model components that can be standardized or adapted. And then, of course, the question has to do with outcome. Right? Are you looking at how this adaptation or standardization impacts sales or profits? Or are you interested in just increasing the number of users or user satisfaction? So there are different measures of outcome in digital ventures than you might find in traditional internationalization studies. So basically our propositions are P on this model is P1 through 6, I believe. And you can see there's a slight interaction. There we go. So, we say that proposition 1 was that, digital ventures have to deal with liability of foreignness. That's the P1. P2 and P3 talk about informal and formal. What we suggest is that the type of venture you're dealing with actually moderates how strongly informal and formal institutions will impact this need to standardize or adapt. And so it's a fairly straightforward model. And the big question that comes up next is, well, what do we already know, right? Because people have been researching digital companies now for almost 20 years, mostly in marketing, more recently in strategy and IB. So now you can move to the next slide, if you would, Ben. So we decided what was needed before we actually do any research is a literature review to find out what we already know about how standardization or adaptation in digital ventures actually works. So we did a systematic literature review for all the literature through June of 2023, used ProQuest, Web of Science, and Google Scholar to search for these. We also sent out requests on listservs to Academy of Management, American Marketing Association, and Academy of International Business, asking people to let us know if they have an article that addresses these issues. In the end, we identified 146 papers, of which only 49 turned out to be usable. So 89 of the papers we thought were going to be usable and had talked about these business ventures actually only looked at traditional entry. And in the back end of the paper, they said, oh, maybe we should look at digital ventures. So we had to get rid of those. 6 of the papers weren't in academic journals. They were working papers or conference papers, so we did not include those. And 2 of the papers, which made the search a little difficult, were actually looking at internet protocols, because there's actually a fairly large literature on the standardization or adaptation of internet protocols, which has nothing to do with the firm level, I'm afraid. So in the end, we ended up with 49 papers. And I'm quickly now going to run you through what the results were, what these papers basically say. And then we're going to talk about what this means for future research. By the way, I know I'm talking a lot. If you have questions, please jump in or raise your hand, although I'm not really good at seeing the raised hand. So sometimes it's better just to turn your mic on and say, oh, wait a minute, Keith, what do you mean by this? Or I don't understand that, or this can't be right, or whatever it is. So feel free to jump in. Anyhow, the results. So I said we had 49 papers, 43 of them looked at websites. So we talk about 4 different types of digital ventures, right? Websites, mobile apps, social media, and complementers on platforms. And out of all 4 of those, the only one that's seen much interest from researchers are websites. We know almost nothing about, complementers and what they have to do, or people using social media to reach international markets, or those relying on mobile apps. So you can see from the very start, as soon as we saw this, it's like, well, obviously there's a lot more research that's going to need to be done. Now, the good news of these 43 papers, there's actually a large range of home and host countries. So it's not like we're missing important countries, everything from China, the US, Europe, Africa, lots of countries in here. So you got big variation, which is good, but really only focused on websites. Next, we looked at what theories these papers were using. And again, of the 49 papers, only 33 papers actually had any theory. And that includes, I think there are 3 papers that are theory-only papers. So primarily the theory they used is this idea of national cultural differences. And they looked at, some of these liability of foreignness issues, mainly focusing on how changing, standardizing, or adapting the promotional factors on the website would impact your outcome. No studies actually looked at liability of outsidership issues, although 2 studies talked about consumer online attitudes and beliefs and how those might impact how, online digital ventures might be impacted in foreign countries, but they didn't really do anything with it. All right, so that's the theories used. The next thing we looked at were the antecedents or the determinants of standardization of these business model components. And again, only 26 of the 49 papers looked at any antecedents. Again, they mostly looked at traditional liability of foreignness antecedents, such as culture, which was done in almost all 26 papers. And then a few papers looked at a couple other things, some other country factors, organizational factors. A couple of them looked at managerial factors. But interestingly, of the traditional liability of foreignness factors that hundreds of standardization and adaptation papers have looked at, not one of the papers we found on digital ventures actually included all of those factors. And then if we think about the liability of outsidership factors, there are only 3 issues that seem to have come up in papers. Again, the attitudes towards online shopping, which is one of those informal institutional things. The size of the internet market, again, probably an informal part. And then the level of IT or technological infrastructure in a company. So those were talked about in a couple of the studies. The top 2 were actually measured in, I think, 2 different studies. The bottom one was only in a theory study. So again, very little emphasis on the problems that digital ventures actually face outside of this liability of foreignness issue. Then we looked at business model components, right? And how these were measured. How do you measure product, promotion, price, distribution for digital businesses, digital ventures? And again, most of these papers focused on the language on the website, the cultural adjustment of the website, country-specific website design, website layout, the content, interactivity. It's really focusing on the promotional aspect and whether those were standardized or adapted, but really ignores all the other issues. Nothing about distribution, nothing about price, and nothing about the products adaptation. Finally, we took a look at the outcomes. And when Ben shifts this, we'll talk about outcomes. Thank you, Ben. So only 6 of the studies actually linked any antecedents and standardization to an outcome. So again, 49 studies to start with, only 6 of them even consider an outcome other than whether you standardized or adopted your components of your business model. And of these 6, it's really a set of mixed results because some looked at user satisfaction as the outcome. A couple of them looked at performance. And so again, it's really telling us very little about whether standardization and adaptation of different components of the business model helped firms using digital ventures be more successful internationally. So what does this mean overall? Well, here's a summary page. I know it's hard to see, lots of words in there. It's basically our 6 propositions, and we talk about what we know so far on each of them. So, do firms need to understand these traditional liability of foreignness issues? And the question is, well, for cultural differences, the answer is yes, but there's a lot of other issues in there. The traditional standardization adaptation papers have looked at that really need to be studied for digital ventures, because maybe there's something different about digital ventures that they don't have to address all these same issues. But we don't know till research looks at it. Proposition 2, you have to look at differences in digital venture related informal institutions. And as I said, only a few studies raise this issue. It's that attitudes towards shopping. And in that case, it really looked at this, this issue of adaptation. Proposition 3 was looking at digital related formal institutions, laws, regulations, things like that. We found no studies that looked at that issue. Proposition 4 looked at digital related informal and the different digital venture types in having that moderating impact. So number 4 is really that moderating proposition. Again, nobody has looked at that. Proposition 5 looks at whether digital infrastructure impacts it. As I said, there were a few studies that looked at a couple issues, but not all those issues. And then Proposition 6, looking at the entrepreneurial ecosystem. And again, no studies have done that. So very quickly from this summary, you can see that there's a lot of work ahead of us. This is an area more and more firms are internationalizing online. Fewer actually with their own websites than maybe our digital platform complementers, right? Go on Amazon, that's or Alibaba or something like that. More and more firms are doing that. We can't tell them anything about standardization or adaptation of the way they present themselves, the way they present their products. Do they need to change that? So these are really issues that we're way behind on. Companies are already dealing with this. We need to learn what works and what doesn't so we can help them. So the next section, we're going to talk about future research. What can be done? And again, I'm going to address the 4 main areas we've been talking about: the theories, the antecedents, the measurement of these business model components and outcomes. So theoretically, I said up to now, the only thing that's been used is, or almost the only theory used is cultural differences and cultural theory. There's a few other studies that use one theory here, a different theory there, but it's really quite sparse. So we're really thinking that, you might need to combine theories, like especially institutional theory, which covers formal and informal institutions, right? And resource-based view, which will help understand, issues like technology infrastructure and entrepreneurial ecosystems. So developing theory to explain those and how this will impact the business could be important. This whole idea of liability of foreignness, and if you look at the paper, the first 5 or 6 pages is a theory about liability of outsidership. And so you could actually use that theory to drive some of the arguments in a paper. So you might combine institutional theory and liability of outsidership theory. And there's different combinations of theories you can use, but it's one thing that's very obvious is you're going to need a number of theories to explain all these different components: the liability of foreignness components and the liability of outsidership components. So antecedents and determinants, which ones should we be looking at? And it's pretty late here. I forgot to tell you, it's like 6:30 at night. So that's why it's dark in my room and I keep stumbling. So of course, it's pretty obvious, and we were really shocked that all the traditional liability of foreignness issues need to be included in every study until we know which ones impact digital ventures and how. And right now, no one's done that. So if you do nothing else for a study, then take those traditional liability of foreignness issues and survey a bunch of digital venture companies and find out which ones they adapt and which ones they standardize and what works. You'd help us move forward greatly. Of course, we also need to consider those liability of outsidership issues. So some of the typical research questions you might have is, do traditional antecedents impact digital venture standardization adaptation in the same way as they do traditional forms of entry? That's a pretty straightforward question, which we should have an answer to by now, but we don't. And then, do differences between countries in digital infrastructure influence the liability of foreignness and standardization adaptation of digital ventures? How about, right there? So in this paper, we provide you a bunch of these research questions, any one of which you could build a good paper on. And there's lots of them in there. All right, the next issue, thank you, are business model components. As I said, up to now, pretty much the digital venture research is focused on promotional issues with very limited attention paid to product-related aspects. I think there's 2 papers that might have done something on that. So in contrast, traditional standardization adaptation studies commonly look at multiple business model components, not just product, price, promotion, or place, right? But might look at 2 of these or all 4 of them. It was really interesting. And we do a comparison in the paper and we say, here's what traditional studies have looked at, and here's what these digital studies look at. And the differences are just huge. So which business model components do traditional antecedents impact for digital ventures? Is it the same as for traditional firms? Does the impact of these components on the different components, do they vary for websites or mobile apps or social media or online platform, right? Maybe not all digital ventures will be impacted the same way. And so some might have to standardize a promotion or a product, where another one will need to adapt that because it's different, because you're on a website or you're a complementer or you're on a mobile app or social media. So what's the relationship between informal digital antecedents and business model standardization? And again, we need to look at this for each of the 4 business components, not just one of them, because it could impact product differently than price or promotion or distribution. So lots of questions here that can be addressed. And then finally, of course, is and there's this one other issue that we brought up earlier, which is this variations not only by type of business venture that a firm might need to look at, but lots of firms use digital ventures or multiple digital ventures, right? They may have social media presence and be a complementer or have a web page, or they might have a joint venture and physically be in a country and be a complementer on a web page or on a platform, right? So there's questions of standardization versus adaptation and the need to coordinate what you do in these different modes of entering a business. So again, we offer some research questions for addressing this issue, not just a single entry, but if firms have multiple entries into the same country. And then you've got the outcome issue, right? And what the research talks about is strategic fit approach. And the strategic fit approach has been used for years. We used it in entry mode research. It's used in traditional standardization and adaptation research. And the strategic fit approach basically says, if you do what the theory says you should do, you should have better performance outcomes, or better outcomes, however you measure outcomes, right? So it's how well does your strategy fit the theory? It's pretty simple to calculate and to do, but it's really the way we think about performance in international business. So, but what outcomes are we really looking at? So do digital ventures improve performance when they standardize all business model components, or when they adapt them all, or are there some, right? So there's all these questions. And then what are those outcome components you're looking at? And again, if you look at our model, I don't think I list them here because I don't think the next page is anything to do with the research. So, but if you looked at our model, we talked about, are you trying to increase sales? Is that the outcome you're interested in? Are you trying to increase export profits? Are you trying to just increase the number of users? Because for a lot of digital ventures, you need lots of users before you can become profitable. So tracking the increase in the number of users is critically important. So depending on what your outcome issue is, outcome factor, right? The questions don't vary though. Does standardization help, improve your outcome, whether it's profits or sales or number of users or user satisfaction? So these are all issues you need to deal with, or we need to deal with. Excuse me. In new research on digital ventures. I'm a little older probably than most of you in this seminar. And I've got to tell you, starting back in about 2014, every time I did a presentation about research, I told young people, PhD students and assistant professors, that what they should be doing is research on digital business and how digitalization has changed business. And much to my surprise, they didn't listen to me. And so, unfortunately, all the way up to the COVID crisis, 2020, there's very little research outside of marketing on digital ventures. In management, in strategy, in IB, there's almost nothing. As a matter of fact, my study from Gibbs in, I think it's 2016, on how platform firms internationalize, I think we call it iBusiness, but it's really platform firms, is actually one of the top cited papers and one of the earliest papers published on digital business internationalization. That's 2016. Now, since then, I've published probably another 20 papers on digital business, all of which get lots of cites because we need to know what's going on. And I'm still surprised when I talk and I go to the office and I talk to our young scholars and they're doing traditional business issues. And it's like, but business isn't done traditionally anymore. Digitalization is taking over everything. And as Ben knows, this artificial intelligence will be taking over even more.
Yeah.
And so we really, instead of being decades behind in our research as we are right now, unfortunately, we really need to get moving and study these digital issues. Now, I noticed about 2 years ago, If you read Strategic Management Journal, you will have noticed a huge change. Again, before about 2020, they had maybe 3 or 4 papers ever published on digital business. Mm-hmm. Now, in every issue, almost every paper is a digital platform paper. But again, what we're focused on, both in international business management strategy, seems to be digital platforms. And remember, digital platforms is just one of the forms of digital business. Social media has offered all sorts of opportunities. Websites were traditionally the way to do it, and lots of companies still have it. And these mobile apps, it's amazing. There are 1 million mobile apps. If you have a mobile app for your company, how in the world is a customer or potential user going to find you with 1 million others cluttering the landscape out there? Mm-hmm. That's the questions we should be asking and finding answers to.
Yep.
So basically, we're at the end here. Our study raises a lot more issues than answers, as you can see. Future research really needs to look at how standardization and adaptation in firms using digital ventures is going to work, and start by looking at those traditional factors. Don't skip those. Those are going to be important, but some won't be as important for digital ventures as they are for traditional ways of entry. So lots of opportunities for research that'll make a big impact. I mean, think of all the companies that are out on Amazon. I'm sure you've all used Amazon to buy something. My favorite is during the COVID crisis, we all needed face masks, right? So you went on to Amazon and you typed in, face mask, and 10,000 companies come up. So who did you buy your face masks from? Mm-hmm. Now, most of us bought it from the people on the first page there. So what about all those other companies? What if you were one of them? How are you going to attract users to your face mask when there's 10,000 competitors on that platform? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So these are really interesting issues that I think we need to be studying.
Yeah.
So that's my presentation. I thank you all for listening. Feel free to ask questions.
Thank you.